Dead faces in the water. Dead faces everywhere. Chapter 6. Rohan. Summary. Horses always come home. Author's note. Trigger warning for Grima Wormtongue being his canonically creepy self in this chapter. Nothing happens, and nothing has happened, but Eowyn knows what he's thinking, and it's gross. Move! Eowyn bellows, charging down the long hall. She barely sees the startled faces scattering before her, barely hears their cries of shock or irritation as she barrels through, medusilled like a horse run wild, loose flannel and unbound hair flapping like a mane behind her. Out of the way! She has to catch herself by both hands on the doorframe to keep from slamming into the wall as she turns. Panting as much from fear as from the breakneck speed of her dash through Rohan's presidential palace, she stumbles over the threshold into her cousin's room. "What happened?" she snaps. Her brother shakes his head. He is bent low beside the bed, still dressed in muddy riding leathers, his fair hair hanging in disarray around a drawn, sunburned face. "I don't know," Eomer answers just as tersely. "His horse came back alone, him unconscious on her back." "What about the rest of his Eored? What about the riders?" "I don't know," Eomer says again. His voice is grim, his eyes fixed on the limp and bloodied man before him. "Theodred is the only one who came back." He stands, pulling off his heavy riding gloves. They are so dark with blood, the pale leather has nearly turned black. "Stay with him," Eomer says. "I'll get a doctor." Eowyn stares at her cousin. "Why didn't you take him straight to the hospital?" she asks her brother. Eomer does not answer. She does not need him to. They have neither of them trusted the hospital since their mother died there. It would have been better, more sensible, if Eomer had taken Theodred there instead of hauling him up the stairs and down the long hallway to his own bed, yes. But the hospital is not a place her brother's thoughts would turn to when seeking for succor any more than would her own. She knows why Eomer, distraught and fearful, would not go there now. "Stay here," he says again. "I'll be right back." Eowyn does not waste time chiding her brother for the folly of his heart. He squeezes her shoulder quickly as he pushes past, racing back out and up the hall that is still marked by the flushed faces left by her own swift passage down it. She shakes her head and hurries to her cousin's side. Theodred lies so still upon the bed that he seems halfway dead already. Eowyn has to check his pulse before she can let herself believe he lives. When she draws her hand back in relief, the fingers shake. She glares at them for wasting energy on such a weakness and crouches down by Theodred. She does not have to search for the source of his distress, at least. The wound is nauseatingly evident, flesh torn from his arm so deeply that she fancies she can almost see patches of bone through the slurry of blood and ravaged meat. His whole side is drenched with red, and Eowyn does not waste time swearing either before she gets to work, drawing her long hammer-hand knife and cutting away the shredded leather sleeve that failed to shield Theodred's tender flesh from whatever wreaked this damage upon him. There is a tourniquet bound tight above his elbow. No doubt it is the reason he has not died already. Eowyn recognizes the red-drenched cloth as her brother's favorite handkerchief, and knows the knot for his handiwork. It is a comfort to her heart to see the sign of Eomer's care for their cousin. But Eowyn knows that love alone is not enough to spare a life that death is stalking. Their mother's fate was proof enough of that. The tourniquet raises another concern. If Eomer was the first person to tend Theodred's wounds, what happened to all the men and women who were riding with him? Was he separated from the rest of the Eored before this violent mischief befell him? Or has something terrible happened to them all? Éowyn will not find answers kneeling in sorrow at her cousin's bedside. She pushes herself to her feet and hurries from the bedroom into the attached bath, where she swears under her breath at Theodred's meticulous but idiosyncratic sense of organization. Everything he owns is put away neatly in its place, but none of those places make sense to anyone but Theodred, and right now is not a good time to be searching through tidy shelves and cabinets. Finally, she finds the supplies she seeks and hauls them out from under the sink with a growl. She twists her hair up in a messy knot when it slips forward over her shoulders, then shoves everything under one arm so that her hands are free to yank on a pair of sterile gloves. The bathroom door has swung shut behind her during her search, so she kicks it open again unceremoniously and hustles back to the bed. The wet crimson patch that stains the pale green sheets has spread, but nothing else about Theodred's condition has changed. He has not moved. He barely seems to breathe. Éowyn uses her teeth first to wrench the cap off the bottle of Athelis essence and then to tear open the bag of cotton balls. She takes a breath that fells utterly to center her and begins sponging delicately at Theodred's mangled flesh. Éowyn is no doctor, but she took the same first aid course as every other shield sister in her youth. She knows enough of the basics to do something other than simply sit on her hands and weep while she waits for Éomer to return with more professional help, at least. She is thankful for that, even as her heart twists in her chest and her stomach lurches at the feeling of butchered meat against her gloved fingers. Éowyn has never been one for sitting helpless or waiting patiently. There were many reasons to hate the hospital, even before the doctors there felled her mother. And she knows that if she was forced to sit and look at Theodred in this condition and do nothing, she would already be screaming. A patter of footsteps at the door has her twisting on her knees to look over her shoulder in hope. But it is not a doctor standing in the doorway, but rather Grima Wormtongue. Éowyn turns away again in disgust and returns her attention to Theodred's mutilated arm. "Where's my uncle?" she asks, without looking back. "The president is in a meeting," Grima replies. His voice caresses her ears like cold oil. "He cannot be interrupted." Éowyn's face is turned away from Rohan's vice president, her head bent low over her cousin's bloody body. She does not need to hide the cold scowl that she can feel freezing her features. "He can," she declares. "His son is hurt." "He will be told as soon as the meeting ends." "He should be told now," Éowyn snaps. Grima chuckles. "The business of the state cannot stop simply because the president's son took a little tumble from his horse, my dear." Éowyn rounds on him, her eyes blazing like lightning across a storm cloud. "Does this look like a little tumble to you?" she demands, her voice gone brittle with pain and anger. She flings a hand out as though Theodred were a prize horse being shown to an eager judge. His red blood is bright against the slick palm of her gloves. Grima slinks forward out of the doorway, and Éowyn tries not to shudder. She understands the political necessity that required her uncle to choose Wormtongue as his running mate, just as she understands why she must be civil to the man despite the way he makes her skin crawl. Grima has too much influence, too many connections within the nationalists and isolationists of Rohan to be lightly insulted. If her uncle wants to pass the more important of the policies on which he built his campaign, the policies that inspired him to run in the first place, the policies that will carry Rohan into the future instead of leaving it festering in a speciest version of the past, then he needs Grima. But oh, how he makes Éowyn's skin crawl. He blinks pale, bulbous eyes in a way that makes him look more like a snake than a man as he stares, white-faced and expressionless, at the bloodied body of the prince of his closest political ally. Is all he says. Éowyn's hands clench into fists so tight that if she was holding anything but soft, blood-stained cotton balls, they would have snapped within the sudden, sharp cage of her fingers. My uncle will be furious once he learns that his son was hurt, and you kept word of it from him, she cautions the vice president coolly. Agrima says again. If he was injured so badly, why was he brought here instead of to the hospital? Éowyn can feel the hot flush of blood rising in her cheeks. She turns away, resuming her careful cleaning of Theodred's ravaged arm. There is a pile of bloody cotton balls on the bed beside him now, and the Athelas bottle is almost half empty. But it seems to have made no difference to the terrible wound before her. She hopes the doctors come soon. My brother was not thinking clearly, she forces herself to say. Her voice is clipped and icy, but it is all she can do not to round on Grima and start shouting at him. Frozen civility is miracle enough right now. No one could possibly expect more of her in these circumstances, surely. No, Grima smirks. No, I dare say he wasn't. Tisk. Unspoken is the clear, constant reminder that Grima believes Éomer has never thought clearly in his life. Has never stopped to think in his life. The reminder that Éowyn's bold, brash brother is a liability to Theoden's political efforts. The reminder that Theoden's orphaned nibblings are both here on sufferance at best, and that it would be so much better for Rohan if they weren't. Éowyn grits her teeth and swallows the barb as she has swallowed so many of Grima's sly insults and insinuations over the last 5 years. May I ask a favor of you, Grima? She says, swallowing against the taste of bile that the words leave on her tongue. You know that I would do anything for you, my dear. So long as it is within my power. Éowyn is glad she gave herself the task of cleaning Theodred's wounds. It serves as an excellent excuse so she does not have to turn around and look Wormtongue in the eye. Would you go to my uncle and see if his meeting has ended yet? Her hands shake with the effort of keeping her voice level. Blood splatters the pale bedsheet. If it has not, will you see if it is at a point that may be interrupted? I am certain that a politician as shrewd and experienced as yourself will be able to find a good moment to tell him that his son needs him. As a favor to you, my dear, Grima coos, and Éowyn thinks she can hear his greasy hair sliding forward over his shoulders as he bows. I will do my best. Thank you, she makes herself say, though she cannot make herself smile. Fortunately, she is still staring at the mangled flesh of Theodred's arm rather than at the more repulsive sight of Grima's face, and so she does not have to. After one last thin, sour chuckle, he leaves, and Éowyn feels as though an iron band has been cut from her chest. She draws a breath deep enough that her ribs ache at the end. Even the slick copper stink of blood and decay that fills her nose is a panacea after Grima's noxious presence. She peels the bloody gloves from her hands and drops them onto the pile of cotton balls. There is nothing more she can do for Theodred's wound, not with her hands shaking like they are. Agrima has never put his hands on her, has never even tried to, but the oily tracks his grasping eyes leave across her skin will make her shudder. Éowyn knows that if she ever spoke aloud the way Grima Wormtongue makes her feel, makes her squirm, her uncle would dissolve their political partnership so fast that even the most vulturous reporters would be left reeling. That is why she does not speak of how he makes her skin crawl, not even to her brother, with whom she shares everything else. That is why she pretends she cannot see the looks Éomer shoots her way when Grima says something a little too salacious, a little too sly, checking to see if she has noticed, checking to see if she is bothered, to see if he is the one overreacting, misinterpreting, jumping too fast to the wrong conclusion. It makes Éowyn sick, seeing her brother doubt himself like that. But for all of his faults, Grima is no fool. Éomer does not stop to think before he speaks, before he acts. And Theoden cannot afford to alienate his vice-president. Rohan needs Theoden, and Theoden needs Wormtongue. So Éowyn holds her tongue and freezes her heart to keep it safe, and is careful to never stray anywhere alone without a knife near to hand. Not that Grima has ever touched her, not that she thinks he has the courage to try, but she feels so much better knowing she has a knife near to hand when he looks at her. She looks at the knife now, lying on the bed where she dropped it after cutting her cousin's sleeve away to bare his wound, its pale blade sticky with his blood. A careful cleaning with the astringent disinfectant and soft cotton gauze she brought from the bathroom restores the knife to its former state with an ease that Éowyn wishes she could duplicate with her own heart. She sheathes the blade again in its customary place at the back of her jeans, where her loose flannel shirt hangs down to cover its hilt. Not that anyone expects a citizen of Rohan to forego the practicality of a good knife at their belt, even in Meduseld. Perhaps especially in Meduseld, where the weight and beauty of their culture surrounds them like the glow of golden sunlight on a green field. Éowyn prefers wearing her knife somewhere that will not be readily glimpsed, not because she is ashamed to be Rohirric, not because she is ashamed of the way of her people, but because she does not want anyone, least of all her nation's vice-president, to ever take the sight of her seemingly weaponless for proof that she is unarmed. Better for all of them if Grima thinks she always has a weapon in easy reach, which she does, even though he cannot see where the blade is sheathed. That knowledge may keep any wandering urges of his hands in check, which will enable her to continue to endure the wandering of his eyes without her having to try cutting those hands off for the crime of an unwelcome caress. Her uncle does not need that sort of political incident, and Rohan needs Theoden. Éowyn has survived worse than Grima Wormtongue's leers. For her uncle, for her people, she will survive this too. But oh, she does not like to think that she owes him a favor now. Éowyn pushes that thought aside for a later day. Right now, Theodred is what matters, not Grima, and not her. Éowyn brushes her hand across her cousin's face, smoothing back his sweat-damped hair, and then she pauses, and frowns, and presses the back of her hand to his forehead. He is burning up, his fever blazing so that it almost seems to scorch her own cool skin. Éowyn takes her cousin's hand, the one on his uninjured arm, and squeezes the limp fingers in her own. "Theodred, please, wake up," she whispers. "Theodred, please." His hand is so cold. It feels like she is gripping ice, or a corpse. He is burning up, but his hand is cold. Made curious by fear, Éowyn explores the contrast further. He is cold everywhere she touches, save for his face and the skin around his awful wound. How can he be blazing so with fever and yet cold? Éowyn does not know if that is normal, does not know enough of health and sickness to tell. She wraps her fingers around Theodred's hand again and hopes the doctor will come soon. Where is Theoden? Surely Grima has told him by now. He would not pass up the chance to do Éowyn a favor, to put her in his debt. Surely her uncle will come soon. Her uncle and the doctors both. She checks her phone, but there is no signal. The Palantir network that ought to connect all of Rohan, both with the rest of the world and with itself, is still down, victim to whatever glitch first cut them off from the relay to Gondor and the world beyond, and then even from each other. She cannot call anyone for help. She can only wait for it to come to her. Éowyn makes a face and shoves the useless phone back into the pocket of her jeans. And she waits. She waits. The day is passing. The sun outside the window sinks down until its rays bathe the room blood red. Surely someone will come soon. Éowyn does not know how long she sits there, feeling her flesh slowly go cold around her cousin's hand. His breath rattles in his chest. The cold creeps up, quenching the fire of his fever. His breath catches, and shakes, and falters. It fails. Éowyn stares in horror, counting silently to herself as she waits for his chest to rise again. It does not. It does not. With a wretched cry, she pulls herself free of the death grip that Theodred's cold fingers have curled into around her hand. She runs to the door, catching herself on the wooden frame again when she stumbles. "Help!" she shouts. "We need a doctor, please! Help! He's dying! Someone help!" Éowyn screams until she runs out of air, and then she clings there, panting, listening for the sound of running feet. Surely someone will come now. Surely someone will come. Over the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears, the rasp of her own breath in her throat, she hears a noise in the silent room behind her. She turns back. "Theodred?" Eowyn whispers. From the bed, something that is no longer her cousin moans. Up next, a little father-son road trip bonding. Dead faces in the water. Dead faces everywhere. Chapter 7. The High Pass. Summary. A little father-son road trip bonding. The sound of the engine, which had been their steady accompaniment for so many hours now that it feels like the rumble of it must be baked all the way into their bones, finally fades. The silence that follows is so strong that it almost rings, feeling somehow louder than the engine for a moment. Then it is broken by two car doors opening and closing, and the heavy stomp of dwarven boots across rough ground. "Ah," Gimli says, holding his arms up over his head and stretching all the way up onto his toes before bending over and grabbing for his ankles. His spine crackles in relief. "That feels good. Don't go tumbling head over heels and rolling back down the mountain now," Glóin chides him teasingly. Gimli rolls his eyes and stomps off into the brush that lines the overgrown road for a few moments of very specific privacy. Behind him, his father snorts into his beard and then goes groping for a handkerchief. Dwarves are not people of sunlight and trees, and the pollen of so many plants is making his nose drip. That doesn't mean that Glóin can't appreciate the view a little as he turns to look back down over the land behind them. From this point of the high pass, he can see great fields of green and brown stretching out behind him. Sunlight sparkles off the curves of distant rivers, and birds that he cannot name twitter in the sparse trees that dot the steep mountain earth around him. This is not a place for dwarves, outside in the summer sun with nothing around but green plants and feathered flying things, but it is still a mountain, even if they stand on the outside of it rather than within. It is still a good place, in its own way, even if it is not a dwarven one, and Glóin takes a few minutes to appreciate the land around him. Also, it is simply nice to be out of the car for a little. Glóin always thought the plush seats of the Mahal Motors Mountaineer to be the epitome of comfort, but after 3 days of being crammed into one as the car jolts and bounces its way up an uneven mountain road, he is beginning to revise that opinion. Like Gimli, Glóin stretches out his stiff muscles a little, but he does not have his son's enthusiasm, nor his youthful flexibility. He contents himself with smaller motions, working the bones and joints as much as anything. Even dwarven bodies, which are stiff and stony by nature, can become uncomfortably rigid after too long confined in one tight space, and it feels good to ease that stiffness and get the blood flowing again. Glóin groans happily as he sinks down onto the warm bumper of the car, luxuriating in the feeling of stretching his legs out before him without pedals to interfere or the press of a belt across his chest to draw him back. He listens to the crackling sound of Gimli stomping through the brush, at this point finished with his moment of privacy, and now just giving his blood a chance to wake up, too. Glóin glances over and sees his son shooting glances over the edge of the mountain, clearly also taking a moment to enjoy the view. And he smiles and ducks his head before Gimli sees him watching and accuses him of getting sappy. Gimli is still too young to understand, but he will one day. Sappiness is an inevitable side effect of fatherhood, and not something that any dwarf stands much chance of resisting in the end. He scratches absently at the bandage that sticks out past the edge of his rolled-up sleeve, and lets himself wonder what being a grandfather will be like. The day is many years away, of course, if it should come at all, but out here in the warm sun, with the air blowing past crisp and clean on the side of a high mountain, it is a nice thing to contemplate. Certainly better than the ugly plague they left behind in Erebor, the grim knowledge that cannot be forgotten, and which drives the urgency of their travel. Glóin catches himself scratching harder and makes a face into his beard. The itching is a good sign, he knows, a sign that the wound below is healing. Still, that knowledge does not make the itching pleasant. With a sigh, he pulls his hand away before he can dislodge the soft white cotton or do some damage to the oozing scabs that lie concealed beneath. He still can't believe that Keely bit him when he went to hug his poor, feverish nephew goodbye. Glóin sniffs and curses the pollen all around them. He wipes his nose again as he hears Gimli laugh. "You all right, Da?" his son calls from the other side of the car. Glóin looks down at the handkerchief in his hand, and feels a chill run up his bones, despite the warmth of the sun overhead. "Fine," Glóin barks, staring at the spots of blood on the pale cloth. "Just a bit stuffy from all this damned greenery." Gimli chuckles and returns to whatever he was doing before. More stretching, Glóin thinks absently, from the sound of soft grunting and shifting cloth. And Glóin shoves the bloody handkerchief deep into the pocket of his jacket. He shivers, despite the warmth of the day. "All right, time's a-wasting," he declares, taking care to make his voice as cheery and boisterous as though he were calling a crowd in for a feast. He shoves himself to his feet and unrolls the sleeves of his jacket against the sudden chill. "We aren't out here to sightsee, after all," Glóin says, and is abruptly reminded of the sight of Dori coughing into that bloody handkerchief of his back in the dim and empty council chambers. Is he well again by now? Or has he succumbed, like so many have, to the disease, to be lying even now in a feverish stupor in a bed lined with chains in the increasingly crowded hospital rooms? Are the dwarves they have left behind getting better on their own, or are they still getting worse? Has anyone died yet? Glóin shivers again and pulls his jacket tighter, buttoning it up high beneath his beard. As anxious as their hurried trip has been so far, he feels more than ever now that they are running out of time. Summer lies thick and green upon the crowns of the trees, but autumn will follow soon enough, and the snows of winter after. Time is passing. Time is running short. Glóin can feel it as though it is crawling through his very bones. "Back in the car," he orders. Gimli grumbles good-naturedly, but he doesn't hesitate. He understands the urgency of their journey, too, after all. He walks back to the car, taking the chance to stretch his arms up over his head and tug at them one last time before he has to climb back inside. His shoulders protest the movement, but they revel in it too, and some of the ache of travel lifts from his muscles. Glóin's aches do not lessen. The stone of his bones is too old, the boulder of his heart too heavy.
"In fact,"
he says slowly,
"why don't you take the wheel for a while?"
Gimli freezes with his hand on the door.
"Duh?" he says. "Are you talking pyrite?"
"No."
Glóin shakes his head. He tosses the keys to Gimli.
"Go on, if you're going to."
"But you hate my driving," Gimli says, even as he hurries to the other side of the car and slides into the driver's seat before his father can change his mind.
Well," Glóin shrugs. "Nobody else on the road all the way out here, is there? What better time for you to drive?"
"Duh,"
Gimli groans.
"That was one time, and I was barely 60. I'm not going to hit anything now."
"Certainly not if you don't get moving,"
Glóin says mildly. Gimli curses him affectionately and starts the engine. As the car rumbles off up the mountain pass, Glóin turns his face to the window and discreetly wipes his nose again. His hand comes away, bloody. Up next, simple folk free from care and fear.